Hey guys, it's that time of the week again. Bigfooter Gary. We've got another user incident, account, story, legend, whatever you want to call it. Another one that I found very believable, and it comes out of the States again, Ohio. And I'm just going to go ahead and read you guys this account that was sent to me. Bigfooter Gary, I absolutely love what you are doing with the new channel. I'm Bigfoot obsessed, and with good reason. I like your other videos too, but mostly I'm a Bigfoot person, so that decision to move all of the Bigfoot content to one place really is awesome. I have a story for you that was passed down from my grandfather to my father and then me. I heard my grandfather tell this tale many times, and I 100% believe it happened to him exactly as he describes, as my grandfather was not a teller of tales in any way. He was a man of facts, and both my father and I agree, as we have talked about this tale amongst ourselves, that my grandfather was not a man to make up stories and tell wild tales. My grandfather was born in 1933 on a farm in Ohio. His name was Russell. He grew up a few miles outside of Circleville, which is the biggest settlement around in modern times, and the population there is probably less than 15,000. Do we have a neck of the woods? I don't know, as most of the area around here is farmland. However, just to the south of us, we have Tar Hollow State Forest, Zaleski State Forest, and Vinton Furnace State Forest. So you could say we have a good mix of open farmlands with beautiful rolling hills and creeks. Not too far off, we have a heavy, thick forest with good cover for things unknown. My grandfather was 13 at the time of this incident. He was one of 7 kids on the farm, the youngest. He had finished grade 8 the previous spring and elected not to go back to school that fall, as his father needed all hands on deck running the farm. My great-grandmother had become ill earlier that year and was lingering but not doing well. She did go on to pass later that winter, but her fate has nothing to do with this story. My grandfather was working the farm with his father and 6 siblings and an uncle. All had chores and duties. My grandfather's was milking and cleaning stalls in the evening, but seeing as this was autumn, late October or early November, he could never remember the exact month. This was also the season for hunting. No, it was not my grandfather's job to get deer for the winter larder, but he took it upon himself to learn as much as he could from his older brother Montgomery, who was the family breadwinner when it came to hunting. My grandfather had access to an old .303 British rifle from World War I. My family had migrated here from England, and the gun had no doubt come with them. It was, as my grandfather claimed, well used, but a true shooter. He had seen Montgomery take a few deer with the rifle and had spent the previous 2 seasons hunting with his brother, helping with the hunt whenever his chores were done and other pressing matters were dealt with. This particular evening, Montgomery and some of the other family members were going to hitch the wagon and head to a local dance. Of course, with Russell being the youngest, he had not been invited as room in the wagon was limited. My grandfather had no interest in dances anyway, and he saw this as an opportunity to head out across the south fields about 1.5 miles from the house to his brother's favorite deer blind. My grandfather knew his brother had scouted a few really nice bucks there over the last couple of weeks, but had not taken one yet from that location. Grandfather always said he felt bad about that after the fact. He had not intended to show up his brother or ruin the spot for him, but that he simply loved hunting. If he could do anything else in the world other than farm, it would be hunt. My grandfather remembered that it must have been early afternoon, no later than 2, when he made a deal with his uncle. His dad's brother worked the farm as well, and he had a soft spot for Russell. Grandfather said he must have felt bad for me not getting to hitch a ride into town with the others, because he offered to do my evening chores if I wanted to head out and go for an afternoon hunt. Of course, my grandfather jumped at the opportunity, and he quickly packed a meal for the trail, borrowed his brother's work boots and gun, and began to head across the open fields to the deer blind. There were 2 creeks that ran together at the southernmost edge of the cleared fields that we own. To this day, there are thick woods around the creek's edge on both sides. The water always kept the forest growing thick down in those lower areas, and most of the original property owners used those as natural dividers for land back in the day. As a general rule, those areas are never cleared, and the creeks keep on flowing under the shadow of the forest around them. As it so happened, this deer blind my grandfather was headed for was right along such a spot. The blind was a thick brush pile right along the edge of the forest. Open fields rolled off to the north and eventually back to the family farm. Directly behind the deer blind was the edge of the thick woods that dropped down to a low creek. The blind that he and Montgomery had made consisted of a good tangle of branches, hickory, basswood, and some maple that had been scavenged from the woods down by the creek. But that main bench they were using to sit on was a large oak branch that had come down in a windstorm earlier that summer. It was too large for the boys to carry, and so one day they had used the workhorse to drag it over to the edge of the woods. There they had built around it the blind for cover. It was at least 24 inches around at the base and 8 feet long. The boys figured they could get a few seasons out of it if they set it up in the right spot. The location of the blind made for ideal deer cover, as the deer would take to the forest during the day where they had access to water, shade, and would venture back out into the fields in the evening to graze. Grandfather arrived at the deer blind and he was setting up. As he was setting up, he could smell the most putrid rot coming from somewhere. It smelled like something dead, and so he began to search the underbrush. Not far from the blind, my grandfather was astonished to find a deer leg, hoof still attached and maybe 16 to 18 inches long. It was half rotten, with large chunks of flesh still attached. There was no way he could sit in the blind with that smell around him, so he picked it up and flung it down into the woods towards the creek. As he turned around, he said he found a second one. It was not until he picked up the second one to toss that he noticed the bones were cracked like they had been snapped off the deer. My grandfather was puzzled and a little scared. He knew his brother had been here at this very blind the week before, and he had not mentioned any dead deer. My grandfather tossed the second leg down with the first, and he continued back towards the blind. As he continued back towards the blind, he found the deer's head. He said it was missing the eyes, but everything else was there, including a large chunk of hide that went down the spine. Part of the spine was still attached to the head, and the hide was wrung around the spine like it had been twisted off. As he kicked around in the long grasses, he said he found 3 more legs and a few other bones, along with part of a rib cage. That meant that there were at least 2 deer here. No saws had been used on the deer, so my grandfather knew it was not a poacher. He thought it very strange, and it did make him uneasy. Unlike today, grandfather says there were black bear around back in those days, and he chalked it up to a bear kill. It was that time of year that bears are fattening up, so maybe a bear had made these kills, eaten his fill, and moved on. My grandfather took all the deer parts and carried them into the hollow by the creek and dumped them where the smell would not reach him in the blind. It had been a long walk down here, and it was not very often that he got the chance to get out of doing chores. There was no way he was going back to the farm before dark, as he knew he would simply be given more work to do. Down in the creek bottom, my grandfather stopped as he heard the brush in front of him moving. He froze, sure that deer were going to burst out and make a run past him up into the field. He did not have his gun with him, as he had set his pack and gun down back at the blind. He could hear something walking, but saw nothing. He squatted down low to the ground so the deer would not see him, and maybe his scent would not be picked up as easily. Very slowly, my grandfather made his way back up to the deer blind. The whole while he said he could hear walking behind him, but he could never see anything. As he neared the edge of the woods, he heard from behind him a loud owl call. It made the hair on his neck stand up. He had not been expecting that. Something was not right. It didn't feel right. But grandfather was determined to hunt the last 2 hours before dark. As he moved the brush around to get in the ground blind, he said that the owl called again behind him. Looking back, he could not see it. In the blind now, it didn't take long for things to cool down, as the sun was already low in the sky. There was a slight breeze blowing from the north. That was perfect. The fields were in front of him, and the conditions were perfect for deer to come out and feed. And my grandfather was sure that he was at least going to see a deer, if not get a shot at one. An hour passed, and sure enough, far out in the field, movement caught grandfather's eye. 2 deer were moving across the field, a large doe and a small buck behind. They were quite a ways out, and grandfather decided to wait for them to move in closer to the blind. 300 yards was a long shot, too far. The deer moved very slowly towards grandfather, too slowly. It was getting dark, and he knew he couldn't wait another 15 minutes. It was past time to shoot and gut a deer. He would have to head back to the house if he did shoot a deer and get help and a lantern. But even that thought wouldn't stop him. He wanted to get a deer and show Montgomery that he had learned everything he had been taught and that he could now help provide for the family as well. So when the deer finally reached that 180-yard mark, or thereabouts, grandfather took his shot. He leaned the gun against a thick branch in the tangle of blind and squeezed off a single shot. The little buck dropped right there, stone dead. My grandfather said he was elated and surprised that he had actually made the kill. That was short-lived, as he had to go retrieve the deer. He heard a loud running behind him, and he looked back towards the creek. The gun was still loaded, and grandfather was sure it was the bear. It was almost too dark to see, but grandfather swore he could see the bear running along the ridge between the creek and the field. He couldn't shoot it as it was moving too quickly and away from him, so he put the gun down and set to work getting out to the deer. In his haste, he left his pack there on the oak bench. Grandfather found the little buck, and he gutted it right there. Twice more he heard that owl call as he worked. It was making him very uneasy, as this seemed so out of place. Even though the deer was small, it was still way too heavy for him to carry back to the farm. So he decided that he would make a run for the house, and hopefully his uncle would come and help him fetch the deer back home. So literally, he said, he shouldered the gun and ran. It was almost full dark, and there was a chance his father might be upset that he was out there without a light and that he had waited so long to shoot the deer. All of that worry was unfounded, though, as he didn't even make it back to the farmhouse when he saw his uncle and father coming across the fields, each with a lantern, laughing as they came towards him. They waved him down and explained that they had figured what had happened when they heard the gunfire. Both men were quite happy for him that he had shot a deer. Grandfather was filled with pride and thankful that his father was not in the least bit upset with him. They all turned to make their way the 3/4 mile back to the deer blind. It was full on dark now, and they could only see as far as the lantern's light reached. As they reached the site of the kill, my grandfather became confused. Yes, it was dark, but he had a very good idea of where his deer lay, and as they walked up through the field, he realized his deer was gone. His father and uncle at first both assumed that the boy was just wrong in the location, as they could all see the trampled field and blood, but there was no gut pile and no dead deer. The three of them scoured the field for the next half hour. Finally, my grandfather remembered the bear and told his father what had happened, and that the bear must have come out of the woods after he had run for home and dragged the deer off. Great-grandfather and his brother were very skeptical and said that they would not be a normal bear if it had done that. As they turned to head for home, my grandfather remembered his pack back at the deer blind. Taking a lantern, he ran the 100 yards back to get it. As he reached the blind, he almost panicked. The blind was a mess. Branches were strewn all over the place, wrecked, destroyed. And strangest of all, the large oak bench that had been too heavy for Montgomery and him to carry was gone. In the middle of the wreckage was the pile of deer bones he had carried down to the creek earlier. The eyeless deer head with the twisted spine staring up at him, stinking and rotting. The three men went home that night confused and wary. It was such a strange incident that they returned the next day to puzzle out what had happened. They found the large oak bench 200 yards down the creek, laying across the creek. It had not been dragged into the woods, it had been carried and placed there. They never did find my grandfather's pack or the deer he had shot. There were no bear prints or any other tracks that they could discern. To his dying days, my grandfather insists that the owl he heard that night was no owl, and that what he thought was a bear was no bear. A bear would not pick up an oak log and carry it off. A bear would not place rotting deer bones or kill, as what my grandfather then called a warning. It was a clear, "we do not want you in these woods" warning. From that point on, and to this day, we do not go to the southern fields. We do not hunt there, we do not play there. It is a haunted place. I am not saying we don't work the fields, we do, but it is always the one place you don't linger. My father says that back in his day, him and a few of the cousins did play in those woods, but too many strange things happened, and eventually they just stopped going. My father has a few good stories about those woods, but for now, this story will have to do. Know that to my knowledge, it is legit and as truthful as a telling as I can relate, seeing that this event did not happen to me personally. Best of luck with the channel, Gary. We watch regularly and thought that you should know we have had our own experiences here. These things are real, and personally, I believe you are right. They're animals, not interdimensional beings from another dimension. Flesh and blood, smart, strong, and elusive, but still just animals. Natalie in Ohio. Well, there it is, another really cool account, guys. I can kind of relate to that in stories that I heard from Brian back in the day up at his camp. They talked about a log being dragged across a creek to stop them from coming down in the canoes. And Brian had told me that 4 men couldn't lift that log out of the way, or they struggled to get it out of the way so that they could get the canoe back down the river that night when they finished their hunt. So stories like that, that is not the first time I've heard something like that, and it has a ring of truth to it. The dead deer bones, I've heard other stories where guys have talked about that, where deer have been found with snapped necks and legs broken off, weird angles, things like that. So absolutely, you know, is Bigfoot hunting deer and eating deer? That is one of the hypotheses, you know, that they're following deer herds and moving. Could absolutely be. So Natalie, thank you for the story. Thanks for watching, guys. If you have a story, email it to me, unfrequentedworld@gmail.com. I've got about a half dozen more to present to you guys. I just have to get the editing done, but I'm always looking for more, so keep them coming. Thanks, guys.